Chapter 3. No, General Zay finding Chief Scientist Ko-Sai is as much a priority as locating General Grievous. Our survival depends on a strong army, and that means the highest quality clones conscription of ordinary citizens is a poor second, and would be politically unacceptable. Find her if only to deny the Separatists her expertise. You have the best intelligence assets the Republic has ever known, so I'll accept no excuses. Chancellor Palpatine, to Jedi General Arlogan Zay, Director of Special Forces, Grand Army of the Republic. Deepwater-class ship I Han, Maigito Space, 471 days after Geonosis. Fearfek. Skirata sighed, watching the transponders mapped on the cockpit holochart. The picket of ships around Maigito made it look as if it were ringed by its own constellation. I know Bakar is keeping them busy down there, but that's still quite a gauntlet to run. And we're a 45-meter cargo ship, Ordo said. Just a laser cannon by way of armament. Mandalorian crew in full Beskar. Definitely not a Republic vessel. What do you think? Just walk in. Could do. Nothing links us to the Republic. And I always carry a range of current transponder codes, so that's an easy fix. Well, we won't win a battle with a warship, so that's our choice made for us. Of course, a submersible sensors are perfect for getting an accurate three-dimensional scan of the site. In we go then, Ordika. Ordo studied the long-range orbital scan of the landing site. It was a vast glacier in a landscape of sheet ice and crystal rock. The penetrating scan showed few crevasses, but the sheet was honeycombed with irregular tunnels that meandered around one another, like tangled yarn and occasionally crossed. The straight, uniform outlines of the ventilation shafts were easy to identify by contrast. Around the warm shafts, underground lakes of melted water had formed, capped by thinner ice sheets. Ordo copied the section of holochart to his datapad, and didn't even have to do the calculations to realize that searching each tunnel in the site that Delta had pinpointed would take days. Too long. An idea formed immediately in his mind, as well as a theory on what had happened to Val. He might have fallen into the warren of tunnels, or through the ice into the liquid water beneath. It wasn't good either way. Crystal worm runnels, Ordo said. It's fascinating how life forms survive even in the most extreme places. If Val's out in those temperatures, said Skirata, he won't be one of them. It's been hours. Even in his Beskar, the seals won't keep out that kind of cold indefinitely. Ordo slid his electronic toolcase out of his sleeve and took out an overwrite probe. He selected a randomly generated transponder code with a Mandalore prefix, and Ihan ceased to register as licensed on Mon Calamari. Okay, Calbur. Now or never. He maneuvered Ihan into a landing trajectory and wondered whether to brazen it out by pinging Maigito traffic control and requesting permission to land. No water on board, a civilian vessel that anyone could scan to confirm its configuration. He'd sort that the moment they got out of here, and a couple of wandering Mirs at the helm. Even with a battle going on, he might get away with it. He opened the traffic frequency. Maigito TC, this is Mandalorian cargo vessel I Han. Request permission to set down for replenishment. The pause was longer than he expected. Ihan, this is Maigito TC. For Mandalorians, you're remarkably slow to notice we have hostilities ongoing. Maigito, scan our tanks for water. The next pause was even longer. Ihan, we note your tanks are zeroed. Unfortunately, our city facilities are closed. Remember the hostilities? If he was turned away now, he'd blown it. They'd drawn Maigito's attention to them. Maigito, there appears to be water just under the surface west of the hostilities, and Mandalore does give assistance to the CIS. We'll refill at our own risk. Ihan, okay, go ahead. And don't try to sue us if you sustain damage or injury. Make sure you're off the planet in 2 standard hours. Ordo felt his shoulder muscles relax. He hadn't realized he'd tensed them. Maigito, understood. He closed the link. Skirata winked at him and grinned. Kalbuir was proud of him, and it made him feel as safe and confident now as it had when he was a small child. "It's amazing how rarely you need to use force," he said, relieved. Without the coordinates from Delta, Ordo knew he wouldn't have known where to start the search for Val. Mygido's surface was a windswept icescape, dazzlingly pretty for a few minutes, and then fatally disorienting. Ordo set Ihan down between cliffs on the edge of the underground lake and sealed his armor, and as he opened the hatch, the wind shrieked and howled. He slid off the hull, and Skirata dropped down beside him. "He's been out here for 4 hours, Calbuir." Ordo activated his helmet's infrared filter, adjusted it to its most sensitive setting, and cast around on a square search of a 20-meter grid. "If he's dead, I might still pick up a temperature differential, but it's unlikely." Skirata paced the imaginary grid with slow, silent deliberation, sweeping a handheld scanner across the surface to locate holes and fissures, and then scanning for temperature changes. Ordo suddenly wondered if he'd been tactless, and that Calbuir might be upset at the thought of Val being dead. The two men had been at each other's throats ever since he could remember, but they also went back a long time, including all those years training clones on Commando, erased from the galaxy and dead to all who knew them. "I'm sorry, Buir," he said. "Don't be." Skirata checked a readout on his forearm plate. "I'm scanning for metals. This detects 20 meters down." Skirata might have been genuinely unmoved, interested only in the proceeds of the robbery. For once, Ordo couldn't tell, but he doubted it. Skirata felt everything on raw nerves. They paced slowly, leaning against the wind, and Skirata seemed to be cycling through his comlink frequencies because Ordo was picking up spikes on his system. Val might have left a link open. It was worth trying. "No paw prints," Skirata said. "Winds probably swept them away." Ordo switched from infrared to the penetrating sensor. It was like checking in mail slots, a tedious progression from one hole to the next. A recent fall of snow was drifting, filling in the depressions. He could be anywhere. He might even have got out and found shelter. Skirata tilted his head down as if listening. Ordo caught a burst of audio on the shared comlink. "If he is, his helmet systems are down. I'm getting static. He might be down too deep." Ordo was starting to feel the cold seeping through his armor joints. If this had been his GAR issue suit, he'd have had temperature control, but his Mandalorian Beskargam was more basic. He'd fix that as soon as he got the chance, just like he'd upgraded his helmet. It wasn't as if he spent a lot of time working in it. He'd never thought to check how Val's suit was configured. It was just matte black, an image he dreaded as a kid, and now unsettlingly like Omega's Katarn rig. Black was the color of justice. Calbuir's armor was sand gold, the color of vengeance. Ordo had opted for deep red plates simply because he liked the color. But black or gold, if Val didn't have cold-proofing or some other protection, he'd be dead now. "Don't laugh, son," Skirata said. "But I'm going to try something old-fashioned, just like you talked your way past the picket." He stood with his arms at his sides and yelled, "Murd! Murd, you dribbling heap, can you hear me?" The wind was drowning out his voice. He clenched his fists and tried again. "Murd!" Ordo joined in calling the stall's name. He almost expected to see a patrol closing in on them, but his helmet sensors showed nothing. "Strills can stand cold," Skirata said, pausing to get his breath. "And they've got better hearing than humans. It was worth a try." He tapped his forearm controls, adjusting his helmet's voice projector to maximum. Murd. How would they even hear the animal if it responded to their calls? Ordo was about to go back and start using the ship's sensor systems to probe deeper into the ice, but he heard Skirata say, "O Sikir," in surprise, and when he turned, the snow was shaking. The thin crust broke. A gold-furred head pushed through like a hideously ugly seedling, a thick layer of white frost on its muzzle. "Myrd, I'll never curse you again," Skirata said, and knelt down to scoop away the chunks of ice. The animal whined pitifully. "Is he down there, Myrd?" Is Val down there? He hesitated, and then rubbed the folds of loose skin on its muzzle. Map the tunnel for me, Ordika. The holo chart hung in the air, a 3D model of the ice beneath them. The tunnel that Murd had struggled out of ran down at a 30-degree angle and curved close to the margin of the lake before snaking away again and disappearing off the chart in the direction of Jigot. It's about 60 meters down to the bend, and the diameter there is only a meter, Ordo said. If he fell, chances are he came to rest at the bend. Long way down. Skirata had his arms around Myrd, and Ordo wasn't sure if he was hugging the animal or trying to shelter it. It was a marked change of attitude, given that he'd thrown his knife at it more than once in the past. Murd. Find Val. Good Murd. Here. He took out a length of fiber cord from his belt and knotted it around Myrd's neck. Go find him. You couldn't drag him out, could you? Is he stuck? Find him. Murd struggled back down the tunnel, making rasping noises with its claws like a skater. And then there was silence again. Myrd's clever, but a strill can't tie knots, said Ordo. So if Val's dead or unconscious, what are you doing? Measuring, said Skirata. He had a tight grip on the line, watching it intently. Eventually it went taut. Fearfek, there's never a Jedi around when you need one, is there? Bardika could have done his Force stuff and located Val right away. He tugged on the line. Back, Murd. Come back. The line went slack again. Given how much line I'm holding, minus the loop, Val's at 58 meters. If Murd reached him, it'd stay with Val. Trust me, it stopped where Val is when the line went taut. Now all we have to do is get to him. The solution was obvious to Ordo. We breached the tunnel at the thinnest point of the ice, which is where it runs next to the lake, and that's less than 8 meters thick. And flood the tunnel? No. Or flush him into the lake and lose him. Either way, he's dead. Either way, Ordo said, utterly relieved that he recalled every line of the Deepwater manual. I line the ship up, starboard side too, and work through the ice with the boarding tube from the airlock. Dry entry. Skirata looked up at him for a moment. Ordo didn't need to see his face to know what he was thinking. You still manage to amaze me, son. You really do. Just hope we don't hit rock. Myrd crawled out of the runnel and flopped at Skirata's feet, panting. It was a struggle to get the strill into Ihan, probably because it thought they were leaving Val behind, but it was weak and frozen, and that meant Skirata and Ordo could subdue it between them. Ordo set the ship down on the frozen surface of the lake. If the ice cracked and they fell through, that was fine, because it would save him the trouble of smashing through. But it didn't. Shields. What did it say about shields when diving? Reconfigure. He tapped in the commands and waited. Amber indicators changed one by one to green. Okay, now avoid any serious impacts. Ordo lifted Ihan clear of the surface, climbed steeply, and fired a laser round at the lake at what he hoped was a safe distance from the ice wall. Steam plumed up beneath him like a geyser. A chunk of ice lifted vertically and bobbed for a second before sliding back again. The lake would freeze over fast. Brace for dive, he said, and took her in a slow nosedive. Osik. Oh, yes. Do other people live their lives like this? Do they take these kinds of risks? It wasn't the time to worry about that. Ordo hadn't yet met a problem he couldn't solve or a situation he couldn't survive. Ihan pushed through the shattered surface, and even at low speed it seemed like crashing into solid rock. For a moment, Ordo thought he'd got it badly wrong, but the slow ice impact wasn't anywhere near as violent as weapons fire, and the shield held. Chunks scraped and screeched as she passed through the slush layer, and then everything went quiet in clear twilight water. They were in the lake itself. Now he had to align the airlock with Val's position. You knew the hull would take that, right, Ordika? Skirata jumped out of the co-pilot's seat and pulled off his helmet. He looked shaken. Of course I did. Well, 90% sure. Okay, close enough. Let's do some scanning. The airlock was nearly 2 meters in diameter. Ordo aligned it at Vao's rough position and used the penetrating sensors to look for a dense mass. Skirata went into the starboard cargo bay with his metal scanner and opened the inner airlock hatch. The warning light lit up on the console, and Skirata's voice crackled over the ship's intercom. "Big immobile lump of durasteel and Beskar about 6 meters in," he said. "Good old Mandalorian iron. You can't beat the stuff. That's Vao, all right." 6 meters. That was a pretty thin wall between the tunnel and the water. At least there was no worm activity, but there was no way of knowing if the shockwave from the laser round would attract them. "Let me reposition. I'm a meter off. I can't tell if he's alive. Okay, we've got to cut through that ice now." "Heat it," Skirata said. "We can vent the meltwater through the tanks." "About 80 cubic meters, maybe less." "Okay." Ordo hiked the thermostat on the environmental controls. They needed to raise the temperature of the exposed ice on the other side of the airlock any way they could. Maybe a combination of heat and cutting. And my Guido TC wants us out of here in about an hour and a half. Ordo extended the outer docking ring until he felt it embed in the lake wall. "Come out of the airlock, Calboir. I need to test for leaks. Clear?" "Clear. I'm going to see what we've got in the tool locker." "Okay. Closing inner airlock." The status light changed to green again. He put Ihan on autohelm to hold her steady against the ice wall. Opening outer hatch. The sensors showed no leaks. When Ordo maneuvered the safety cam inside the airlock chamber, he saw a smooth, glassy disk of dirty ice. A few meters on the other side of that lay Wallen Vao. If they got it wrong while they tried to cut through the wall, the water would flood in and sink Ihan. It was a lot of trouble to go to for a few credits, and a man both of them disliked. On too many occasions, Ordo had wished Vao dead. Now he found himself willing the Chakar to stay alive. Special Operations Brigade HQ, Coruscant, General Arligan Zoe's office, 471 days after Geonosis. Sev thought it was just as well he had a reputation for being uncommunicative. General Zay walked up and down the short line of 4 commandos, as if he was doing an inspection, pausing occasionally to stare at a detail of their armor or look into their eyes. If the Jedi thought that would psych out Delta Squad, he'd have a long, long walk ahead of him. Sev stared straight ahead, hands clasped behind his back, boots planted firmly at shoulder width. In his peripheral vision, General Jusik sat on a table swinging his legs. His disheveled Padawan image didn't fool anyone. Sev had been on enough operations with him to know that he could make Scorch look overcautious. Zay's ARC trooper aide, Captain Mays, prowled the room as if he wasn't listening to the debriefing. On balance, Sev preferred the null ARCs. They understood in a way that the men trained by Fett simply didn't. Zay came to a halt in front of Boss and stood with his nose almost touching his. "I'm not stupid," he said quietly. "Am I, Sergeant?" "Sir, no sir," Boss barked. "Want to tell me what went wrong with your exfiltration?" "Sir, we encountered some resistance and were forced to exit the complex via an unreconnoitered passage, sir." Sev felt for Boss. They'd all made the decision to stick with Vaw, but Boss was the boss, so he got it in the neck. Sev found the occasional trips back to HQ unsettling. He wanted to be back out in the field with just his brothers for company, because Coruscant wasn't their world, and he'd already had enough of it. Zay was still in Boss's face. "This wouldn't have anything to do with Skirata, would it, 3-8? "Sir, no sir!" Well, that much was true. Nobody had actually lied to Zay yet, because Jedi had a way of telling if someone was lying. Zay took a pace back, seemed to be suppressing a smile, and then shook his head. "Well," he said at last, sitting down behind his fancy lapis-inlaid desk. "Good result on my Guido. General Ki-Adi-Mundi has sent his commendation." "Don't care. What's happened to Sergeant Vao?" "Can we eat it, sir?" Scorch asked, straight-faced. "I realize you returned with indecent haste, Delta." Zay turned to Mace. "Captain, once I'm through with this briefing, Take Delta straight to the mess and stand over them while they eat the recommended daily intake. Mays, looking less than thrilled by his nursemaid duties, grunted, "Sir." Jusek, who'd been staring out the window, suddenly flinched as if someone unseen had walked up behind him. Jedi were weird. "But before you eat, gentlemen, here's your new brief." Zay flicked a holochart into life, and the familiar planet-studded grid settled in the air over the briefing table. "And this comes straight from the Chancellor, a direct personal order. Find Chief Scientist Kosai." Boss was still doing the talking, which suited Sev just fine, because he was far more interested in Vao's fate and was now watching Jusek carefully. The kid was like a holo receiver. He picked up all kinds of stuff from distant events. Maybe he detected something now. He certainly looked distracted. "And when we find her, sir, bring her back in one piece." "Bummer," Fixer muttered. "Sir." Zay managed to smile. "I know you have little to love the Kaminoans for, gentlemen, but I don't make the rules. Lama Su is adamant that Kosai defected and that she didn't die. He won't give his reasons, but that probably doesn't matter because the Chancellor wants a tame Kaminoan scientist for our own use, so we aren't beholden to Topoka, should they ever change their minds about our favored customer status." The general shook his head as if he was arguing with himself. "So haul her back here. Top priority. He ordered me to put the best team on it." Sev accepted that it was true. They were better than Omega because they didn't go soft and get diverted by personal issues. They had Vao to thank for that. "She's been gone a year, sir. Why make the move so late in the day?" Boss asked. "I'm not privy to that information, Sergeant," Zay said carefully. "But the intel we do have, via the Kaminoans, suggests that she's passed through Vainai within the last 6 months." Sev didn't know the Kaminoans had any kind of intelligence, seeing as they almost never left their homeworld, but they could clearly buy it in from outside. He chalked Kosai up to the long list of objectives that Delta had been set and tried to come to terms with his fears about Vao. Boss broke position and wandered over to the holochart to locate Vainai. "Who's tracking her, sir?" "You." "Understood." "The report came from Rin, who do occasional work for the Republic. She's probably long gone, but this is the first positive lead we've had." Sev sneaked a look at Jusek. Something had definitely distracted him, and it wasn't what was happening on the parade ground. The Jedi looked at him and gave him a discreet thumbs up. "What does that mean? Cheer up? His grab ball team won? Vao's okay?" Boss, Scorch, and Fixer were engrossed in the discussion on the significance of Vainai plenty of ocean, and she wasn't likely to be hiding out on Tatooine, and Sev just stood there, eyes pointing in the appropriate direction to look like he was following the debate. Fear. Yes, it was fear. Everyone got scared, but this was different. A gnawing, hollow void in his stomach. He'd let Vao down when it mattered. If Vao survived, he'd beat Sev within a breath of his life. If he didn't, he'd haunt him. "Try harder, Sev. You let your brothers down. You let me down. You let the whole Shabla army down. Try harder, you lazy little Chakar, or next time it really will hurt." Sev had tried so hard that he'd collapsed on his bunk most nights without even getting his fatigues off, and then had to catch up on his laundry in the early hours, when Reveille made his heart nearly leap out of his chest, and he got up with his head still buzzing with lack of sleep. He was 5 years old. He hadn't forgotten. Sev was now the best sniper in the Grand Army because he didn't want to let anyone down. And this stays within this room, gentlemen, because this is the Chancellor's pet peeve. Zay's tone jerked Sev back to the present. Nobody else in Special Operations knows about this, and I really don't want Skirata to know, because, fine man though he might be, he does have an issue with Kaminoans. Any man who refers to them as Tatsushi and actually boasts of recipes is probably best kept out of the loop. Dismissed. Scorch chuckled approvingly as they clunked their way down the corridor toward the mess with Maze at their heels. "You think Skirata would really eat a Kaminoan?" Fixer managed a sentence which was good going for him. "Only if he had hot sauce." "What do you think they serve us? That isn't rollerfish on the menu. Scorch half-turned as he walked, trying to drag Sev into the conversation. You okay, Sev? Terrific. They couldn't mention Val in front of Maze. As far as Zay was concerned, Val had done the Maigido Recce and banged out. He certainly hadn't robbed a bank and plunged down some ice hole to freeze to death if he hadn't already broken his neck. Never better. The sound of boots walking briskly down the corridor behind then broke into a clatter. Jusik caught up, looking flushed and almost pleased with himself. I'll keep this lot in line, Captain, he said to Maze. Ned, I'm sure you've got better things to do than make them finish their greens. Maze turned on his heel immediately and began walking back to the command center. Whatever it is you're doing, he said, thank you for not involving me in it, sir. Maze wasn't stupid. He didn't want to stand between two Jedi generals playing a game. Nobody in their right mind would. Boss stood back to let Jusik enter the mess first. Well, General, I feel that Val is alive. And we left him behind, Sev said. We don't do that. Jusik took Sev's arm discreetly and applied a little pressure. And you were out of options, Private. If he'd wanted extracting, he'd have asked. Scorch grabbed a plate of seed breads and slapped them on a table to mark his territory. Few of the other commandos sat near Delta at mealtimes because they were one of the last complete squads who'd been decanted together into Poca City and stayed together this far. Heavy casualties in the early days of the war, Sev hated himself for believing all that guff about Jedi being invincible military geniuses, meant that most commando squads had been reformed at least once, and just didn't have that extra cohesion that Delta did, Sev was sure. All but one of Val's squads had stayed in one piece. He might have been a savage instructor, but it was all for their own good. He said so. It was true. So what now, sir? Boss asked. How do we make this disappear? The voice traffic with Skirata? Don't kid yourself that Zay doesn't know something went on. Jusik could switch from being a goofy kid to a hard man in an instant. He seemed to be learning a lot from Skirata. He has to at least pretend to stick to the rules. Leave it to me. Those comlink records will vanish before anyone knows they exist. Thank you, sir. You made the right call to pass the problem to me instead of Zay, Jusik said. You might feel disloyal, but what he doesn't officially know can't get him in trouble. Will you let us know when they find him? Of course I will. If anyone can extract him, Kalbur and Ordika can. Jusik grabbed a seed bread from Scorch's plate and got up to leave. The Force tells me things will work out. Sev watched him go. If the Force was that chatty, it should have been telling the Jedi about useful strategic stuff, not vague fortune-telling. Kalbur, Fixer mocked. Boss didn't seem too upset about Val to eat. Wow, he's got it bad, little Jusik, hasn't he? Regular little Mando ad. Hey, our Sarge is missing. Sev clenched his teeth to keep his voice as low as he could. Val could be dead, and you can eat and joke? We abandoned him. We left him to die. We never leave a man behind, guys. The other three stared at him like he was telling them something they didn't know. Take it easy, Sev. We're all worried. Best thing we can do, Scorch said, is do our job and let everyone else do theirs. You get that gem of wisdom off a ration pack label? Sev snapped. Shut up and eat. You'll think straighter on a full stomach in a few hours' sleep. Scorch grabbed a passing server droid. Full Cory breakfast for the young psychopath here, Tinny. Sev ate too fast to taste the food, but at least it filled a hole, as Fee would have said if the annoying little jerk had been here. Sev wasn't sure if he missed Omega or not. On balance, he did, and it was all for a few credits. There weren't enough credits in the galaxy to make it worth leaving a comrade behind. Sev could imagine nothing worse. If he ever saw Val alive again, he wondered if he'd have the guts to apologize to him. My Guido, deep-water submersible Eye Han, depth 58 meters, 471 days after geonosis. Skirata wasn't sure if the fluid dripping off his nose and chin was spray from the melting ice or his own sweat. They'd been hacking at the ice face for an hour now, and the space was too confined for both of them to work at the same time. They took turns. Skirata found he needed it. It was hot, damp, and numbing labor. Melting was useless. It seemed to be freezing again as fast as it thawed. He put his full weight against an inadequate hydrocutter and took another chunk of ice out of what he saw as a 6-meter tunnel. His hands were numb and tingling from the vibration. I'm getting too old for this. Val, why the shab are we even bothering? I put my boy at risk for this? Ordo tapped him on the shoulder. Break, Kalbuir. Skirata put the cutter on standby and found he could hardly move his legs. Ordo, with that perfect, silent understanding, grabbed him by his boots and hauled him out of the airlock tube. Skirata leaned against the bulkhead and then slid down it in exhaustion. His hands felt lifeless. He shook them hard to stop the tingling. It wasn't the time to say that they could have left Val. They were both at the stage where they couldn't think of much beyond the next minute, and the next chunk of ice pulled free and pushed out onto the deck. The cargo bay deck was scattered with wet gravel freed by the melt. The pristine white landscape disguised how much debris there was in the compressed snow. There was another thunk from the airlock like a brick falling off a wall. Skirata struggled to his feet and stepped in to clear the ice out of Ordo's way. Even the noise of the cut-ting disc couldn't drown out Murd's whining and yelping, and he wondered if the Strill would claw clean through the hatch to get out of the locked storage compartment. Even if nobody else loved Val, that animal certainly did. The good thing about repetitive and desperate physical labor was that it stopped you from speculating too much on things like the ice that had refrozen across the lake, the possibility that the lake wall would collapse under the weight of the water anyway, and that, working now without their sealed armor, they'd drown if the boarding tube gave way. Clunk. Ordo was young, strong, and fit. He was removing the ice a lot faster than Skirata could. "Rewarming!" Ordo yelled. Skirata was partially deaf from too much time spent around loud explosions without a helmet, but he could hear him. "When we get Val out, he's bound to have hypothermia, however good his armor is. Gotta get him thawed." "What?" "Rescue breathing. Warm air in the lungs. Mouth to mouth." Skirata wasn't thinking fast enough. "Oh, sick. Maybe Mird can do it." The one thing they had plenty of now was hot water. The tanks were full. Val could at least have warm compresses. "Warm sugar water." Ordo grunted with effort, and there was another clunk. He was going well. It's all about raising core temperature. Skirata broke out his ration pack. He never imagined he'd give Wallon Val his last energy blocks. Here he was, worrying about a Chakar who'd beat his men badly enough to put them in a med center, when he had his boys, Jusik, a pregnant, Etain, and now Bessany Wenin to fret over, and they all deserved his efforts a lot more than Val. "Chakar," he said to himself. "A cryo-droid might be a good investment." "What?" "I said I think a cryo-droid might be a good investment. Ice-breaking." The drill drowned Ordo's voice for a while. Should be able to melt ice faster than this. It was a long half-hour. The brief spells at the ice face were getting harder each time, and they needed to save their energy blocks for Val. Skirata felt his strength ebbing faster. The gravel released from the ice dug into the palms of his hands when he crawled into the tube, but they were so numb now he could hardly feel it. Eventually he resorted to his blaster, and the steam made the compartment feel like a Santa-steamer. Ordo checked the thickness of the ice. Nearly there. At least it's warm in here. "I'm sorry, son. Getting you into this. Good training. Never done this before. You should be out on the town with your girl at your age, not... I don't feel right about using Bessany to spy for us. It was right out of the blue." Ordo did that from time to time, revealing what was on his mind, and making Skirata realize he didn't know everything about him, not even now. He must have been chewing it over while he slogged away at the ice. "Muriel didn't force her, son. She knows the score." I meant that I wasn't expecting to feel bad about it. So again, Skirata knew even less about Ordo than he thought. He decided not to comment and just let the lad ramble on, but Ordo went quiet again, and more lumps of dirty, gritty ice fell out onto the deck as the cutter whined. He'd had his say. The Republic uses you, son, but now we're using the Republic. Let an asset like Beseni Wenin go to waste. A breath of burning cold air on his face, and a shout from Ordo snapped Skirata out of an exhausted trance, and somehow his adrenaline got him back on his feet. We're through. I see him. There wasn't enough room for both of them in the tube. Ordo hacked frantically at the rapidly enlarging hole. When he leaned back to reach for a fiber cord line, Skirata could see a black shape that didn't look like a man for a moment, but then he could make out part of the T-shaped visor of Vao's helmet. I'm cutting his packs free. The operation was now more like delivering a Nerf calf. After much swearing and panting, Ordo backed out of the boarding tube, hauling Vao by a line around one shoulder. It sounded like he was dragging a coffin. Vao plopped onto the cargo bay deck in a heap, his armor so cold that it burned Skirata's fingers as he eased off the man's helmet. Vao's hard, gaunt face was almost blue. Skirata pushed his eyelids back to check his pupils. They reacted to the light. Humans survived low temperatures even when they looked dead, and Vao was definitely alive. Skirata mentally listed all the procedures he had to follow, like looking for a pulse, counting breaths, not rubbing extremities, and diverting warmer blood from the core. Osik, Wallon, you Shabuir, don't you dare go and die on me now! Vao's head rolled and he mumbled back at Skirata. Mird, he said. Mird. Skirata had gone after Vao at least twice in his life, fully intending to kill him. His instinct, funny thing that it was, now focused him totally on saving the man. Ordo slithered backward out of the tube again, dragging Vao's beer gun and a large bundle of plastoid sheeting that chinked and clacked. Rescue breathing, Calbuir, he panted. The effort had even taken its toll on Ordo. He grabbed Vao and half-dragged, half-carried him into the medbay, heaving him onto the bunk. Skirata trailed behind with the bags. I know your cussing can generate a few kilowatts of heat, but it's not reaching his lungs. He's conscious and breathing. No CPR. Okay, dry. He's dry. Wet clothing leached the heat fast. The suit held up. Skirata pulled off Vao's armor and grabbed whatever he could find from the locker to wrap him up. His fingers showed no signs of frostbite, corpse cold but still soft. That was something. Let Mird out. Mird shot out of the store compartment and nearly knocked Skirata over. The animal was good and warm. If anyone was going to snuggle up to Vao and transfer heat, Mird was the best choice. Ordo watched the strill flop onto its master with delighted little squeals and rumbles, slobbering over his face. Ordo seemed to find it suddenly funny. Thanks, Mird, he said. You saved us both from a fate worse than death. Carry on that strill. He turned to Skirata. It's time to seal up and get out of here. How are you going to break the surface ice? Ordo shrugged. Torpedo. Well, the laser didn't attract any unwelcome attention, so go for it, son. I'll get some hot liquid into Vao. Secure him in the bunk, because we're going to be banging out of here at quite an angle. You might want to hold off the hot liquid until we're stable again. Ordo never exaggerated. When he said quite an angle, he probably meant vertical. A few moments after the shock of an exploding torpedo bounced back at them, everything they hadn't had time to stow securely went sliding to the bulkheads, and Mird howled, claws nailed deep into the bunk housing. Han leveled out. The loose objects thudded back down on the deck. Drink this, Skirata said, lifting Vao's head with one hand and holding a beaker of the cube-sweetened hot water to his lips. Mird gave Skirata some grudging space, but spread itself down the length of Vao's frame. Get it in your gut, Wallon, or I'll have to heat your innards by shoving a blaster down your throat. Vao coughed, splashing a fine spray of spit in Skirata's face. I'm going to tell everyone. What a soft chakar you are, Cal. Well, his cognitive functions were just fine. No confused rambling there. Skirata ticked one more symptom off the first aid list. Can you feel any injuries? Not yet. You look worse than me. Come on. Skirata slopped more liquid into his mouth. He felt wrecked now. Get this down, you. Tell Delta. Okay, yes. Val had a few saving graces. He knew his lads would be worried sick about him, and that they needed to know he'd been extracted. Will do. Now what the Shab was worth nearly freezing to death for? What the Shab, Val said hoarsely, was worth nearly killing yourself. To save me. I wanted your armor. Better environment seals than mine, obviously. You could survive a Sarlacc in that. Val actually smiled. He didn't do that often. He had very even, white teeth that proved he'd had a healthy and well-fed early childhood. Beer gone. Take a look inside. Ordo's voice cut into the ship's comlink system. I'm heading for the RV point, Calbuir. I've informed General Jusik that Val's inboard. Good lad, said Skirata. Good lad, Val chorused. How much did this sub cost you? Shut up and drink. Skirata waited until he'd forced 3 beakers of diluted energy cubes down Val's throat before giving in to an animal curiosity that overrode every weary ache and pulled muscle. He untied the bundle. As the contents spilled across the medbay deck, there was only one word he could spit out. Why? Val made a coughing sound that might have been laughter. He didn't get a lot of practice at that. Skirata was transfixed by the tide of valuables, so much so that his hands were shaking when he unfastened the backpack's assortment of pouches. What spilled out stifled any further comment. He knelt down on the deck, knowing his old ankle injury was screaming for a painkiller, but far too engrossed in sorting through the booty to give it any time. There was a lot here. A lot. Hundreds of thousands of credits. Worth. He stretched out his hand and rummaged cautiously. No millions. Skirata started making a mental inventory almost without thinking about it. Old habits died hard. When he glanced over his shoulder, Val was watching him, eyes half open as if he was nodding off. Mird kept guard, snuffling occasionally. Except for the inside pocket, he said. You can keep the lot. What do you mean, keep the lot? I'm not a thief. I took what was rightfully mine. The rest is a donation to your clone welfare fund. Wallen, Skirata said quietly, this is something like 40 million creds at least. Stunned or not, he could always compose himself enough to carry out a blisteringly accurate valuation. You nearly died to get it. You sure about this? You're still in shock. You... Sure. Sure. You liberated it for the lads? Well on, that's... I liberated it to cover my shebs, Val said. Skirata nodded, suddenly unable to meet Val's eyes any longer. Of course you did. If the only items missing are from the Val deposit box, then it narrows down the suspects. Val reached out for the beaker and managed to get it to his lips. He spilled a lot of it, but that was okay. He was recovering fast. Just made it look like good old-fashioned random thieving. Your dad couldn't touch you even if he did work out that you'd come back. It was clearly one admission too far for Val. He was definitely embarrassed, not angry. Look, Cal, when you were surviving on dead Boruts and gravel and playing the working-class martyr, did nobody teach you how to steal like a professional? Val usually didn't have to do much to get Skirata fighting mad. Breathing was normally enough. This time, Skirata simply knelt there with his chin lowered, struggling to find the right words to tell Val he was moved by his generosity. Thanks, he said, fidgeting with a spectacular erodium ingot. Thanks, Niarvad. Nervad. He'd never called Val brother without a good dose of sarcasm. 40 million creds went a long way with Skirata. But remember my men too, Cal. If they need help when the time comes, I expect it to be given. Wallen, This is for every clone who needs help, not just my lads. I'd buy out all 3 million of them if I could. As long as we understand each other. I'll get Ordo to inventory this. He's good at that. They didn't have a crumb of food on board Ihan, but they were rich. Or at least Skirata's rapidly expanding plans to secure the future for clones. His clones, Vow's clones, any Shabla clone he could get out of the GAR in the end, were well funded. Ordo sat at the treatment table in the medbay with Skirata and worked his way through the hall with a datapad and a distracted frown. "Is this some Mandalorian renaissance you're planning, Cal?" Vow asked. It was starting to feel like it. He hadn't really thought that far ahead. If I set up a place for them all, then it might as well be Mandalore. "Yeah," Vow said. "It might as well." Mir, draped over Vow like a badly made fur coat, watched Ordo with one red-rimmed eye. The other was shut tight. Ordo had never forgotten that Vow had set Mird on him as a kid, and it seemed that Mird hadn't forgotten that Ordo had aimed a blaster between its eyes. It rumbled deep in its throat, apparently reassured that both Ordo's hands were occupied with the proceeds of the robbery. Ordo took a spectral analyzer from his belt toolkit and ran the beam over the gems, diligently noting the composition and weight of each piece in his datapad, with a little frown of concentration, like some heavily armed accountant. Skirata held his breath. Some of the items in the bag were priceless antiques. "Beshavo ancestral icon," Ordo said, and held up a time-stained square of gilded parchment. Collectors would happily shoot their mothers for it. They certainly shot each other. "I hope you know a reliable fence in the fine art world, Calbuir, because we're going to need one." "The fine arts," Skirata said, fighting a hysterical urge to giggle, "are my natural territory." "You're an uncultured savage," said Vol, "but you did save my Shebs. Here, Ordo, help me with my belt." Ordo raised an eyebrow. "You ought to be taking it easy, Sergeant. Open this pouch. Come on." Skirata did it for him. Val fumbled and pulled out a piece of jewelry, a gold pin with 3 square-cut, vivid blue stones of extravagant size set along its length. He could have swapped it for a penthouse apartment in the Republica. Skirata had never seen anything like it. "My mother's bauble," Val said. He tossed it to Ordo, who caught it one-handed. "Give it to that pretty girl of yours, Captain. She'll do it justice." Ordo, always an odd mix of naivete and precocious experience, stared at it with visible dismay. He had no idea how to accept a gift like that, but then neither did Skirata. It was a showstopper. The only people who'd given him assets even remotely like it had done so at the point of his knife. Vol seemed utterly unmoved by wealth, but maybe if you started life that rich, then it ceased to have meaning. Ordo scanned the stone's dimensions, clarity, refraction, density, and tapped the datapad. Approximately 143 carats. His gaze was still fixed on the sapphires as if they were going to explode. "Current market value of the unset gems is 10 mil lion, but it's your inheritance." He sounded like a little boy again, and the fact that it was stolen property didn't enter into the objection. "It's too valuable, I'm afraid." "Take it, Ordo. It gives me great pleasure to know that Ma Vao no longer has it, and that a better woman does." It might simply have been embarrassed bluster, but Skirata felt that depriving his loathed parents of something was exactly what Val wanted. He was a volunteer orphan. It was in stark contrast with Skirata, an orphan who valued family more than anything. He tried to be the best possible father to men who'd been created without the comfort of any mother at all, good or bad. Ordo, as ever, educated Skirata again. The lad was full of surprises. "It's very gracious of you, Sergeant Val," he said, and put the pin carefully in his undershirt pocket. He could be quite the gentleman, just as Skirata had taught him. "Thank you. I assure you it'll be treasured." It took another hour to tally all the items, and some still defied valuation. Even so, Skirata was now looking at 53.5 million credits if he didn't count Ordo's Shironi sapphires, half of it in unregistered secured bonds that could be converted to credits anywhere. While Val slept, and Ordo piloted the ship. Skirata admired the hull for a while, imagining all the safe houses, escape routes, and new beginnings it could buy for clones who decided they'd completed their service to the Republic. He wasn't encouraging desertion. He was liberating slaves. Men who didn't sign up had no oath or contract to honor as far as he was concerned. Eventually, he left Val to his sleep, curled in a fetal ball with Myrd still keeping vigil over him, and wandered off to the cockpit to sit with Ordo. Ordo held out the jeweled pin. Look, they turn green in this light. He seemed more fascinated by the chemistry of them. What am I going to do with them, Calbuir? Skirata shrugged. Like Val says, give them to Bessany. They're stolen. That compromises her. Let me think of something. They'd buy a lot of land and a secure base. Will Val be offended? Not as long as Ma Val doesn't get to wear them again. How terrible to hate your parents so much. But then parents do appalling things to their children, don't they? Like poor Etain, given away to total strangers. Ordo pitied Jedi. It was becoming a recurring theme in his conversation. I'm lucky to find a father who wanted me. We all are. Does he think I was a bad father to my own kids? He never says. I'd kill for you, son, Skirata said. It's that simple. Ordo was a good lad, a wonderful lad. He could pilot a totally unfamiliar ship, even stage a staggering rescue, just on intuition and one skim of the manual, then sit down and balance the accounts. Skirata, choked silent by pride and overwhelming paternal love, leaned over the pilot's seat and gave him a hug. Ordo winked, clearly pleased with himself, and gripped Skirata's arm. Fatherhood was a blessing. It would be a blessing for Darmon when the time came for him to find out, and now Skirata had both wealth and the prospect of Kosai's technology to guarantee a decent future for all of them. But the future was a fragile concept for Mandalorians. Tomorrow was never taken for granted by soldiers, and the Mando, a word for it Venkuyot conveyed optimism rather than a timescale. Venku was a good, positive Mandalorian name for any son. It would fit Darman and Etain's baby very well indeed. Yes, Venku. That SS it. Venku. I never adopted you formally, Skirata said. It had been bothering him in recent days, ever since he began to think of the war as having a definite timescale. Any of you? Does that matter? Skirata now felt that it did. No Mando had would nitpick over the bond between him and his boys, and as far as the Republic was concerned, clones didn't even qualify as people. But his plans to give them a decent future had now become very, very specific. That discovery of Lama Su's terse message to Palpatine just over a week ago had fast-forwarded everything. Yes, he said. He reached to grasp Ordo's hand and recited the short, no-frills Gaibal Manda, name and soul, all it took to unpick history and give a child a new parentage. Mandalorians were habitual adopters. Bloodlines were just medical detail. Ni Kirtail Gai Sa'ad, Ordo. Ordo stared at their clasped hands for a moment. He had a crushing grip. I've been your son since the day you first saved my life, Buir. I think you boys did the saving, Skirata said. I don't want to imagine where I'd be without you. Skirata was now busy hating himself for not doing this before, not making the ultimate commitment, and he fretted about his 5 other nulls scattered around the galaxy. Sometimes he saw them again as 2-year-olds waiting to be cold-killed because they didn't meet the spec the Kaminoans wanted. Uncommandable, disturbed, defective. And Aruatiz thought Mandalorians were savages, did they? The galaxy was full of hypocrites,